everyone. This video is going to be about taking your skirt sloper and making a flared skirt with a yoke. So remember, the yoke is where we separate off part of it. We'll be transferring the fullness down to the bottom to create the flare, and then we'll be separating off a yoke. So the first thing you want to do is trace your sloper, your front and your back. And I would keep them kind of far apart because we're going to need room to bring this out and make it flare. So go ahead and trace off your pattern, your sloper. So once you have this drawn, you're going to add an extension at the back. It'll help with like the zipper and what have you. So that's a 1/2 inch. You're just bringing that out a 1/2 inch, kind of like what you did on the top where we extended in the front to overlap it, to button it. And then what you do is you want to plot the yoke. So the yoke, we're going to remove 1 3/4 inches. That becomes the yoke. So if you measure down 1 3/4 inches, make a mark, 1 3/4 over here. So that's about here. I like to do one in the middle too, just to be sure that I follow that curve nicely. And do the same thing in the front. Just mark that 1 3/4 inches. And at the center front. So you need a curved ruler in order to plot the curve. Now, at the center front and the center back, you want that to be straight. You don't want it to swoop up. So maybe come in about 1/4 inch with a straight line so that you don't have like a point at the center. I notice on a lot of your patterns, the center fronts, everybody's bringing it up to kind of a point. So because it curves more at the hip and the from the straight part of the back, put the straighter part of your ruler to that center, and then we're going to just plot this yoke. So that's going to be where we're going to be splitting off the yoke to become part of the center. And in the front, we're going to do a yoke that has like sort of like a little point to it. So from where the bottom of the dart is that's closer to the center, we're going to do something kind of interesting here with this yoke. Draw a diagonal line. So we're going to have a yoke that comes over like this, but your actual center of your skirt is going to come all the way up to the center. And then, whoops, it should come down there. It should come down to the line that we're going to plot. So it should be straight here at the front, and then it curves up to the side. So you didn't really need the line in the middle. It'll work out pretty good like that. So this is going to become our yoke here. So the next thing that you want to do is divide this skirt from the darts down into sections. So you want to come straight down from the tip of the dart to the hem. If you have the see-through ruler, it's easier to keep it straight and not skew it because you can look through. Your hem is straight, so it should be following one of the cross lines on the ruler. So we're going to go like this, and we're going to come down. Whoops. At both of the darts, in the front and the back. So I'm going to come down here. And there. And then we need one more split. So we need one more split in between the dart and the side seam, and it doesn't need to go through to the top. It goes just to where we're cutting off the yoke. So basically split this in half. So if I have 1 3/4 inches here, that's going to be about 7/8 of an inch here. You're going to split this in half. And you're just going to go straight up to the yoke. It does not go through the yoke. And same thing over here. You're going to split this in half. If you can eyeball it, that's probably fine because it's only for adding fullness. It's not a line that has anything to do with sewing. So then what we're going to do is we're going to separate the yoke from the skirt. So we're going to cut the yoke part off and separate it out. So you're going to need additional paper for underneath for these pieces. So I'm just going to go across here and I'm going to separate my yoke from my skirt back. So that'll be the back. Here's my front. So this one, you're cutting the angle like this, and then across. So it's a good idea here at this yoke line to cross that off because we changed our yoke and it goes up at an angle. So the first thing we want to do is close the darts in the yoke sections. And I'm going to pin this to a piece of white paper. Oh, I hate this paper, how it curls up. I can get it to uncurl. Hang on. So what we're going to do is we're going to close the darts. So if you remember to do that, you cut one side of the dart. I'm going to cut the other side of this dart. And you have to cut the paper above it so you don't have so much, because I got to close the dart. So to close the dart, we have to open the paper above the dart, but I'm sort of leaving it attached. If they come apart, you just have to line it up, but it's easier. Oh, it does have to come apart, sorry. You want to maintain that curve at the waist, but you're closing the dart. So make sure that your edge at the bottom and your edge at the top stay the same, but that you've moved it over so the dart is closed. Oops. There we go. I have such shaky hands. There we go. And then the other section, again, close that dart so you overlap and bring that dart together. Make sure it lines up at the bottom. There we go. So that's together. So then what you do is what's called a truing up. So I'm going to tape this down to my paper here. I can't stress enough how important truing up is, because you'll have pieces that don't fit together properly. So you want to take your curved ruler here, and I'm going to sort of, and I'll do it in red maybe so you can see the difference. I'm going to find a spot where my ruler, let me move that back. I can come along here, and where those darts were closed, there's a little bit of a pointiness to it, so you want to just smooth that out. And then the same thing down at the bottom. Again, we want to just sort of like smooth it out, have it all come together. So that's going to be the yoke back. I would mark it so we don't forget. And this is the center back here. So do the same thing in the front. Trim some off at the top. I'm going to tape the center front down. And then we're going to cut through the dart. And I'm going to close that dart. So your yoke should not look like a square. It should have curve to it. Because you've taken the dart out and you're transferring all the fullness from the dart down into the skirt. And we'll do the skirt part next. So I'm cutting again this dart over here, and I'm going to overlap it and tape that down. And then again, you just want to true it up. The same thing down here. There we go. So this is going to be the yoke front. Now for the skirt part, you're going to, I'm going to cut just below here. Get rid of the extra tissue paper so it's not cumbersome. And we're going to do the same thing where we cut this open. So slash it right to the tip of what little bit of a dart you have, and then cut the dart. And lay it down and close your dart. So I'm going to have this part be straight. So I'm going to tape it down. And I'm going to close this little dart. And basically when you close it, this opening at the bottom should be close to 1 3/8 inches. So you should check that. Each cut that we open is going to be around, I think it's coming out more like maybe 1 1/4. You could push it over a little bit. You can't go too far though, because then you'll make it too small up here. So I've opened that dart, or closed the dart. I'm going to cut the other side here. And we're going to close that dart. And you'll see that opened up the bottom to about the same measurement. Be careful you don't let your paper get all wrinkly and you tape it down and there's a ripple, because then you're losing some of your dimension. And then this last one, that's the slit that's next to the side seam, you're going to open that one up and just leave it barely attached at the very top, just like a 1/16 of an inch. And you want to open this, that 1 3/8 inch, or whatever the rest of them are. So this is like, this actually came out to about 1 1/4. So if you go over and mark 1 1/4 inch, I know that I want this to land right there. That way you have what's called balance. You haven't like added, because you want this curve to be a nice curve that will match putting the yoke on it. If you go too far here, all of a sudden that part pops up and your seam to sew it is going to be really difficult. So we're trying to, equal the amount that we spaced it out. And then to true this up, Take your French curve, and you want this edge to stay straight. You want the curve to go towards the waist there. So I'm just going to correct that curve and bring it to the straight part. So you can see it only went in this size up about 1/16 of an inch, because you don't want this to be a point that you're trying to sew, and this is a point. It should be a nice smooth curve. And then you do the same thing at the hem. This part stays straight, but then it curves over. So you would never take and put a straight ruler and then connect and connect, because then you've got a hem that's like got little points in it. So you're using the curve ruler to bring all of these edges together and create a nice curve to the hem. So then we're going to do the same thing in the front. So I'm going to tape my front down. I'm hoping I'm going to have enough room here to actually have it open up. So tape that down. Tape this down. Make your first cut on the slash line that's all the way to the right. And just leave a little tag at the top hanging open, because you don't want to lose the connection of where that is at the waist. And you want to open this the same amount that you did in the back. So it was about 1 1/4. So I'm going to lay my ruler down here. Here's 1 1/4. Make a little dot. I'm going to bring this back to there. And I'm going to tape these down. So I hope when you guys are working on these samples that you're not just thinking about, oh, I need to get this done because I need 25 points. I hope you're thinking about, like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? And how can I use this in my designs? I don't want to see a disconnect between you're just working to get some points so you can get out of the class the grade you want, because that's not going to matter when you get in the field. If you're ever going to do this particular thing for a living, you think you're going to go do pattern drafting, it doesn't matter what grade you got in the class. I would take a C student that knows how to draft a pattern over an A student that can't demonstrate that they know how to do this. So think about everything you're learning. You're learning it for your career, and you should also be doing this stuff outside of class. You're only getting an introduction to this. You have a textbook that has all sorts of manipulations in it. And I've been sewing for almost 60 years, and I still get the book out and try different things. If I'm draping or drafting something, I go back to the principles and look and see what do I need to achieve, or what tools do I need to achieve it. Am I going to slash? Am I going to drape, or am I going to pattern draft? How will I get the look I'm looking for with everything that I've learned so far? So trust me, you're going to continue to learn for a long time. You'll never know everything. So then here's 1 1/4 inch here. I'm going to pull that back. And I've maintained an even amount of fullness across. Oops, my tape wrinkled, but that's all right. Okay. So take this curve ruler and really work on the curve. Same thing here. Bring this all together. And now you've got all 4 pieces. So the next thing to do is to trace these and make the pattern. You can't really turn this into a pattern with all those cuts. It's all over the place, so it will be difficult to keep this as a pattern and actually lay it down on fabric and cut it out. So usually what I do is I keep this, I make sure it's taped really well, and I've marked it, you know, I understand what it was I did, and then I make a pattern, but I keep this folded up in its original in case I need to make some changes to my style. So you just want to place your paper over it, and I'm going to make the patterns. So here is the yoke. So trace your yoke. I always like to square up the corners so that you don't accidentally make a, sometimes I call them whoop-de-doos, where it flipped up and you've got something pointy that shouldn't really be there. Don't trace things freehand. Do use your rulers. I notice a few people have patterns that look really, the lines look very wiggly, squiggly. And then I see seam allowances that are not the correct amount of seam allowance. So use your tools. So that's the yoke front. So when you make these patterns, you're going to be adding seam allowance. So seam allowance all the way around. Your grain line, make sure that you're putting a grain line. So I'm coming in from the side. Oh, wait a minute. Where do I want the grain line on there? You have to always think with the grain line, how do I want this fabric to hang? So the grain line is really on this. This was my center front right here. So the grain line is really perpendicular to the center front, so it's actually like this. I'm going to do the trace the skirt. So here's my center front of my skirt. The side, remember the side isn't just straight, it does curve up towards the waist. This comes down at an angle, so you can use the straight edge here. This is kind of straight over here. It's straight coming off the hem on the two sides. I need the curve to do the side seam. Whoops, I squared the corner way over off of the pattern. Yeah, that's just extra paper there. All right, here we go. That's nothing. So come across and remember that you trued up that area so you have a nice curve. You don't have it coming down to a point and then going back up. So this is my skirt front. Over here, this is the center front. So you might cut it on the fold. Let's trace off the back. Okay, let's add our curves. you'll never be able to just lay it down and get the exact curve. You're always having to move it to manipulate the curve to be where you want it. Once in a while when you do sleeves, you can get lucky, and it actually, that little curved ruler for sleeves actually will mimic the armhole pretty close, but not all the time. There's a lot of times that it needs a little bit more of a manipulation. There we go. There's that. Oops, it's not very dark. Add your hem. So then you're going to go ahead, you're going to add seam allowances. So let me show you the finished pattern with the seam allowances on it. So let's look at the back first. Here's the back. So here, we're going to do something called truing up. I keep talking about it. I just really want to make sure that I reinforce how important that is. So to true it up, you don't match up the edges of your seam allowance. You're matching up where you're going to stitch it. And you can see that in the back here, what I've done is I've added a double notch here. And this curve comes down further than the skirt, but that's okay because you're adding fullness to the skirt. But you want to walk the pattern up to the seam allowance and make sure that the skirt is the same length at the seam, not the edge. So what I had to do here, because my yoke was slightly wider than my skirt, I wouldn't advise making the skirt small or the yoke smaller. So I had to move those two lines over to actually true that up. And so then you just kind of take hash marks over the seam lines that were wrong so that you don't make a mistake when you're cutting. So that works out. You can also do it where I need a pin. I was taught to walk a seam. So you would line it up the back here and go over as far as it is straight, and you put a pin in it, and then you move it. So it's basically like you're sewing the seam. You're moving over every little increment where it starts to swoop away. So we're to here. Whoops. Now we're to like about here. And I'm coming over. So by the time I get to the corner, you can see that if it was here, I didn't have enough fabric. So I did have to add that little bit. So that's your skirt yoke back. You want to put the grain line perpendicular to the center back. And you want to cut two. In actuality, you would probably cut 4 and put lining on the skirt from here down. Or if you want to make a waistband, you can put a waistband up there. But this would be like a self-facing if you cut 4 of them. And it's nice too because then you're able to cover this seam on the inside when you put the make a self-faced yoke. So here, center back, straight grain. You got the notches match up, and the hem is trued. Now on my side seam, I've put a single and a double notch, and I'll show you how those relate to the other pattern. So here's your yoke front pattern. So you can see that the yoke was split off, and that to sew it, you're here. So you've added seam allowance, but what's being sewn together is this line and this line. So you can actually turn it over and just check to make sure that this line is the same length on your yoke and on your skirt. And you'll notice that I put these little dots. I sometimes refer to them as landmark dots. They don't really call it that in the book, but they're important locations that when you go to sew, like when you're sewing this yoke to here, you would sew from here to here. How are you going to connect those two together? Well, you'll have to cut a slash, so put a little slash line in that corner, and then you would rotate your fabric and your skirt down like this in order to sew those together. So then you also want to walk the seam here like that, or if you lay it over top, you can see through it. And again, I needed to add a slight amount to my, actually I reduced it here. So let's see, how did I wind up doing that? Let's walk it. So I would have sewed it here. You know, I know some of this stuff you guys think is time consuming and, you know, like, why are we doing it? But patterns should be precise. It's like the blueprint for the body. So if you were building a house, would you not have a blueprint? No, you wouldn't expect a builder to come and just start building it from nothing. So this is going to be attached here. And you can have a notch, but it isn't necessary. I'm going to add one here just in case. I think I need it when I'm putting it together. So I want to see a dot here, one here, and here. Where you've added the seam allowance here, you can also go like the seam allowance width up, and this can be removed. You don't need that little bit of fabric that's flopping off up there. So here, I'm going to either cut it on fold and have the grain line being a straight grain. So this is a straight grain that's lengthwise. Or if you wanted to add a seam here, which might make it easier to attach your yoke, you could have the seam and you could cut this on the bias. So if I was cutting this on the bias, that would be a grain line that's like this. And you would mark that as the bias grain. I made this skirt once in a plaid, a gray plaid fabric, and I actually cut it on the bias, so the plaid did this, and it was really, the skirt really moved nice when you wore it. The last thing to true up is you want to check your seam allowance at the side. So when I put this yoke together, do my seams match up? Yes, on this one it does. And sometimes it might be a good idea to, you can also, to check, you could also fold it as if you'd sewn it and now you're pressing it open and you can see it goes together pretty well. I could put like a little double notch here. Now when you do notches, they should be perpendicular, like 90 degrees to the cut edge or your line here, the seam line. So bring your notch through, straight through. Same thing with this notch, bring it down and through the seam allowance. It makes it easier to line them up later on. So this notch here is going to go up through the seam allowance there. Yeah, so everything looks good. Skirt back cut 2, make sure you have a grain line. If you want to put the bias on there, that's just a plus. It's kind of nice to have. So if I wanted this skirt to be made on the bias, here's my bias line. It's really nice if you have one of these cutting mats that has the squares, because the bias would be from one corner of the square to the other corner of the square. That's 45 degrees. So you could mark it that that's the bias grain. So you would cut 2, cut 1 on the fold, or cut 2 on the bias, and then the yokes cut 2, cut 2. So photograph this and submit it. Don't worry if it's late. Danielle always is watching my back and noticed that this video, there was something wrong. So this is the second time I'm filming it because I want to make sure that the video is good, and I'm going to put it back up. So if you haven't done the skirt yet, don't worry about the due date. Just get it done whenever you can. It's really important that right now you're working on your original design and that we're going to finish those.